The American system of naming rhythms is unequivocally superior to all of the others. Things like crotchets, minims, and quavers are demonstrably inferior to the American system, which uses quarter notes, half notes, and eighth notes. Now, if you're an American, you may never have heard of a crotchet or a quaver before, but never fear, fellow patriot, for ignorance is bliss. We can finally take pride in our nation's preferred system of measurement. Yes, it is easy to be embarrassed that there are 12 inches to a foot and 5,280 feet to a mile. Our imperial system is completely illogical, but our rhythmic system is not. To be 100% fair, it's not really our system. It was a system that was calqued, which is a linguistic term which means stolen, from the German system. This was likely because there was a large German immigrant population in North America in the 18th and 19th centuries. This system is a fractional system based upon simple divisions of a whole note, or a ganze nota. You can think of a whole note as like the number 1. The American system of rhythm is like dividing a pizza into delicious rhythmic slices. When you divide 1 by 2, you get 2 halves. When you divide 1 by 4, you get 4 quarters. Are you with me so far? Oh, yes, British Adam. Is the maths too complicated for you?
First of all, I do not appreciate the sarcasm. And second of all, what would you call this? A dotted minim in a bar of 3/4. Shouldn't you call that a whole note? Your system is quite illogical.
First of all, that is a terrible accent. It's not necessary for this framing device at all, so let's lose that on the next cutaway. And second of all, it's a common misconception to think that a whole note means a whole measure. It just so happens that one whole note equals one whole measure of 4/4, an incredibly common time signature. And I hate to say it this way, but mathematically speaking, you can think of time signatures or meters as simply fractions of whole notes. Musically, they're treated differently. 3/4 and 6/8 are very different from a musical standpoint, but mathematically they are the same. 3/4 takes up 3/4 the amount of time as one whole note. How many eighths of a whole note are in one measure of 7/8? 7 of them. Is this too confusing for you, British Adam?
In the British system, you can say that is one crotchet or one quaver, but what is a whole note a whole of?
Well, what is one of? That question doesn't really make any sense because numbers are used to define quantity, and in music, the quantity of which we speak is beats per minute. We think of these beats per minute as pulses, and traditionally we define the pulses as quarters of a whole note. A quarter note in one tempo may be 5 or 6 times slower than a quarter note in another tempo, but it doesn't really matter though, because we don't conceptualize music in terms of inter-onset intervals, a fairly technical scientific term used to describe absolute note length. Instead, we simply define the size of the rhythmic pizza and then start cutting.
Okay, we get it. You like pizza, you're American, you're fat. The whole thing kind of ties together with your rhythmic system. I still don't understand why you don't want to adopt things like minim, crotchet, and quaver, because these are the linguistic terms that our forebears used and have been used to describe music ever since. We need to respect that.
Yeah, so about that. British English, like Spanish and Italian and some other languages, use a bastardization of Latin words used in something called mensural notation, which was an early form of notating rhythm that came about in the late Middle Ages. First you had the maxima, or the note with the maximum possible note value. Then you had the longa, a long-valued note, followed by the breve, or a brief note. A semi-breve was a note shorter than a breve, and then the smallest possible rhythmic duration you could use was something called the minim, or the minimum possible note value. For those of you who are familiar with modern day rhythmic notation, the meanings of these terms don't quite fit with the symbols that are associated with them. For example, there are many possible smaller note divisions than this, the supposed minimum note value. What happened? Well, as the centuries progressed and music progressed, composers started experimenting with smaller and smaller note divisions, like, for example, the semi-minim, the fusa, and the semi-fusa. Since there's kind of a cap on how fast musicians can play, dividing note values over and over again kind of had the effect of a rhythmic inflation. Breves and semibreves, which at one point were used to describe quick notes, soon described note values of longer length, at least compared to the fancier, newer terms that were being used. There was pushback, of course, to these newfangled rhythmic terms. In 1400, Thomas de Walsingham wrote of,
"A new character has been introduced called a crotchet, which would be of no use if musicians would remember that beyond the minim, no subdivision is possible."
The term crotchet, of which Mr. de Walsingham spoke of so disparagingly, came about as a colloquial term to describe the shape of the note. It's an English calque of the French croche, which means little hook. It kind of looks like a hook, right? Makes sense? Well, it would make sense if today's British English referred to this note as a crotchet, but they don't. They refer to it as a quaver, which is another colloquialism used to describe the trembling nature of fast trilled notes played in succession. By the 17th century, quaver became the preferred nickname for this note, and crotchet became the preferred nickname for this one. So crotchet means hook in a different language for a note that doesn't even have a hook, and the note that does have a hook is called a quaver, and it gets even more ridiculous from here. As musicians needed smaller and smaller subdivisions beyond that of the quaver or crotchet or whatever, they began attaching Latin prefixes to the very non-Latin folksy term quaver. A note faster than a quaver became a semiquaver. Faster than that was a demi-semiquaver. Faster than that was a hemi-demi-semiquaver. And faster than that was a semi-hemi-demi-semiquaver, although I've also heard that one called a quasi-hemi-demi-semiquaver. Maybe some of my British viewers will be able to enlighten me on the proper Latin prefix for a note that's faster than a hemi-demi-semiquaver, because I don't know. To put this into perspective, remember at the time, the term quaver was super folksy and colloquial. Think about this. Sometimes American jazz musicians will refer to a whole note as a football because it kind of looks like a football, right? The American kind. Calling something a semiquaver or a demi-semiquaver would be like calling this a semi-football and this a demi-semi-football. That sounds ridiculous, right? But it's no different than the language that modern British English uses to describe rhythms. It's a language built on outdated Latin terms for mensural notation, and then the informal nicknames for those terms, and then later attempts to re-Latinize those informal epithets. It's like our current imperial measurement system, an awkward hodgepodge of incredibly outdated and sometimes downright illogical measurement schemes. During the Reformation in the 16th century, German musicians abandoned the Latin musical terms in favor of terms in plain German. These terms were easier to understand and less opaque, and made music more accessible to more people. It's simple, clean, and elegant, like the metric system. Most of planet Earth is on the metric system right now, so we know that it is possible to change measurement schemes, however hard habits may die. But really, is there a musical reason or a practical reason to compel others to adopt this fractional naming system? As much as it pains me to say this, no. There really isn't a reason to compel others to switch, because the music is the same. We're just using different, albeit better, terminology. Yeah, you might make anecdotal arguments saying that one system is better than the other at learning music in the beginning, but this is not the thing to have dire real-world consequences, like the infamous case of NASA's Mars Climate Orbiter, which crashed into Mars's atmosphere because engineers forgot to convert imperial units to metric units in the software. The worst thing that can come from this is momentary confusion when people of different musical cultures interact on the bandstand. Or, heaven help us all, an 8-page thread on talkbase.com of people talking in circles around each other. It ultimately really is not that consequential, but an understanding of the history and the logic of the language in which we use to describe music can give insight in how our culture understands music. Learning about how we got here right now can be incredibly rewarding. The system that we use for music did not come about in a vacuum. It's the product of thousands of years of human achievement. Deep knowledge of something requires an understanding of the history of that thing, and the history of language and music is essential for understanding and appreciating how music works. That said, the American system rules, the British system drools. Go America, suck on that. Anyway, before we end, I do want to give a special shout out to the French rhythmic naming system. It's not quite as good as the American and German system, but it's oddly endearing in how literal it is, in a way that I feel is not particularly typical of the French language. This note is a ronde because it's round. This note is a blanche because it's white. This note is a noir because it's black. This note is a croche because in this case it actually looks like a hook. This note is a double croche because it has two hooks. It's really quite hard to argue with any of that. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. This is Adam Neely. I have a new video coming out every Monday. If you enjoy what I do here on this channel, please comment, like, and subscribe. And if you really enjoy what I do, please consider joining my Patreon, because it's the patrons over at my Patreon that really let me do this week after week, and I'm very thankful to all of you guys over at Patreon. And yeah, until next time, everybody.
Peace.